Jamila, I'm your host, Jamila Bay. Thank you so much for joining me. And also with me this week is Angela Tucker. She is a filmmaker, and her latest installment in her ever-popular series, Black Folks Don't. This week, she looked at Black Folks Don't Do Atheism. Angela, thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Ian Cromwell. Listeners to the show might remember him as that Canadian science dude. He's joining me this week in his other capacity with the Free Thought Blog Network, and his blog is The Communist Manifesto. Thanks for being with me again, Ian.
Great to be back, Jamila.
This is going to be fun because, Angela, I don't know if you had any idea before you jumped into these waters that there is a rather thriving Black atheist blogosphere. And when you came up with Black Folks Don't Do Atheism, it got spread instantly. I want to take a moment and listen to one of the clips from Black Folks Don't.
Most Black folk don't do atheism, and if they do, they're not wearing T-shirts about it.
No, we don't do atheism. We know there's a God. We believe in him and praise Jesus Christ. We believe Father, Son, Holy Ghost, yes.
Regardless of what diaspora we're talking about, whether it's the islands, the South, the North, it's one of the great links, I think, in Black folk is that it's the belief in God.
I think there's this inbred, instilled fear of God, among most Black people that even if you think you're an atheist, you probably are not. Because somebody will beat it out of you.
That's pretty profound. Black folks don't do atheism, despite the fact that I wear a T-shirt sometimes. But the whole fear of it being beaten out of you. Angela, first, who were these various interviewees from your series?
First, I want to say that, well, in terms of the interviewees, these are just kind of random people. So this second season, we are based in New Orleans. And so we have some man in the street, and then it's, just kind of random people that I send an email out, and I try to get people of all different ages and socioeconomics, et cetera. But this season was actually viewer selected. So Black Folk Don't Do Atheism was the number one voted viewer selection. So what we did was we asked viewers what topics we should do this season, and they came up with a long list, and then they voted, and the top 6 were what we did. And this topic by far got the highest amount of votes. So it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I'm surprised at sort of the number of people that have shared this particular episode. It's by far the most, but it seemed like it was something that kind of people were really clamoring for.
Do you think they were clamoring in the sense of let it be known that Black folks, who statistically speaking are in America the most religious demographic, Black women at least, Black men rank very highly too, they are the most likely to tithe. Something like 80% of African American people, when you break it out by gender, it goes up to like 87% for Black women, who will say there is absolutely, I believe with absolute certainty, that there is a supernatural higher power called God. Do you think people voted on this to say, yes, we are religious people, we absolutely know there is a God, and for that reason, Black folks don't do atheism? Or do you think it was a matter of Black folks don't do atheism, let's squash that stereotype?
I think it's kind of a combination of those things. We did the poll around the time that New York Times article came out about Black atheists. So I do think that played a role in people voting for it, because I think that there were a lot of people who read that article and it spoke to them, and they wanted to learn more about Black atheists. And so this was kind of a direct link to, I can learn more. So I think that's part of it. I also think each of the topics really look at something that there's some kind of stigma around. And I think that atheism in the Black community, there's definitely sort of a stigma around that. So I think that people were interested in hearing voices that they don't usually hear, or just thinking about ideas that they don't necessarily think about.
Now, our friend and neighbor to the north, Ian Cromwell, I want you to weigh in here. As one who is a person of African descent, and you're a blogger, I know for a fact that this Black Folk Don't episode got shared to you. Weigh in for us. What was your take on it?
I thought it was fantastic. I thought the whole series has been less about debunking stereotypes and more about addressing them, finding out where the truth is, finding out sort of from a broad spectrum of the Black community, what people's thoughts are, which I think it's wonderful to be exploring and look closely at these things. I was a bit surprised, despite the statistics, that there was no mention at all of Islam or, five percenters or any of the other, really profoundly culturally impactful Black religious expressions in the United States that continue to resonate, even though they may not have the numbers that Christianity does. They still have a profound influence on Black culture. I was a little surprised that no one took those on. I was also more than a little disappointed that there was no discussion at all of the sort of how Christianity came to be so ascendant. The only person who really invoked the historical parts of Black Christianity got it really, really, really wrong. I'm referring, of course, to the sister at around the 2:30 mark who says, there's a spiritual being that watches over us and has helped us from the beginning of time. And then she starts the beginning of time at slavery, which I think is really sort of disappointing mischaracterization of Black history. There's a long history of Islam being dominant in the African continent, and the way in which that sort of shifted in the past, 300-400 years is a really interesting sociological, anthropological question, and there was no mention of that. But I mean, the video can't be all things to all people. I thought it was a fantastic film. I really, really enjoyed it.
Did anybody bring up Islam or the fact that you were in New Orleans, which is a decisively Christian and Catholic city, not to the exclusion of all others, but was it just that that's what you found?
For me, with the series, I really keep it sort of contained in terms of, being in New Orleans. It was the people that I found on the street, the people that I interacted with. And then, I did a few interviews in New York because we were going to interview Melissa Harris Perry in New Orleans, and we ended up doing it in New York. Anyway, we really try to have it be a study of a certain amount of people over a certain number of days. So, we definitely don't get into other religions. And, New Orleans is just such a Catholic place that I was really surprised by that. I had no idea that New Orleans was as Catholic as it was. So I think by having this show travel, you get sort of a very specific point of view. And so there's just certain things that aren't covered that might actually be very prevalent in the Black community, but because of the group of people that we find, it just doesn't necessarily come up. And I'm pretty, disciplined about not trying to insert ideas because I feel like I want that idea inserted. I really try to be true to, the 25 or so people that I talk to. Sometimes people have sort of ideas around things that maybe they haven't necessarily fully researched, but this is how they see the world, and they're speaking about the world through this lens that sometimes is an accurate lens and sometimes can be an inaccurate lens.
As someone who makes a point in making strides in the getting the issues of race and religion and atheism to an international audience, how do you think the future looks?
Well, I think Jill Scott Heron was both right and wrong when he said that the revolution will not be televised. I think the revolution is going to be live tweeted and live streamed. I think we're moving away from traditional forms point source controlled media and into a much more perhaps anarchist or, democratic form of media broadcasting. And I think it's great. I think the people who are predominantly the beneficiaries of the movement away from mainstream point source media are minority groups, even in a place where I am, like Vancouver, where you may not have a lot of individual level contact with people who are representing different walks of life. You may not get a chance to talk to them. And even if you do, they may not want to talk about that specific issue all the time. But then you have some people who are interested in making a statement about those things, are interested in having a dialogue. I think that we're going to see more people more rapidly taking up these minority perspectives, not necessarily agreeing with them, but at least understanding where they and we are coming from. And I'm really glad to be my own small part of that.
Professor Stephen Finley, who is in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Louisiana State University, let folks know that black folks doing atheism is something that is neither new nor, not only is it not without precedent, but it's probably going to continue.
I can tell you there's a long history of African-American atheists and agnostics, including people like Frederick Douglass and others. People who questioned whether or not there was a God precisely because of African-American suffering. How can there be a God who is supposed to be good, a God who is supposed to be just when white supremacy sort of dominates the planet, black people suffer this injustice, this physical violence, but also this violence that comes through discourses of black inferiority, et cetera, that are centuries old.
This actually brings together a lot of what we're talking about right now. Not only is there this history, we're pretty much on track to, I don't know where we're on track to going. According to a recent study, though, by the Pew Research Centers, 19% of all Americans admit that they are religious nuns. They are without a religion. It doesn't mean that they're atheists, but it does mean that they don't subscribe to any box you can tick off. They are the largest growing segment when you look at religion in the U.S. I imagine our neighbors to the north are somewhat similar. I mean, we're not that far apart. But in terms of spirituality and God-fearingness being equivalent terms with blackness in a number of communities, I wonder if we're starting to see that change happening.
Jamil, I just want to gently correct you on one thing that you said, which is that you imagine that Canada and the United States has similar levels of religiosity. In fact, it's quite different. Our rate of nuns is about 30%. Compared to your 16, and that's mostly because religion is not nearly so dominant and ascendant in Canadian life. Touré, during the film, says, "I don't know where a black person would find space to be an atheist." And on Twitter, I sort of half snarkily responded, "Well, we got a lot of space up here in Canada. We've got one of the most irreligious populations in the world, and it's partially, there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the strength of the social safety net. Part of it is historical, but it is actually quite a different atmosphere. The other point that I want to very quickly make here is, when you talk to most atheists about black communities and black atheism in particular, one of the questions that they often have is, how is it possible that a group that has been so brutalized and so pushed around, not just by white supremacist traditions, but also by the religion itself. It's important to remember that religion was used for years to justify slavery, segregation, anti-miscegenation. Even some of the suffering that's going on today is couched in explicitly religious terms. And to see that, and then to see at the same time that black folks are among the most religious, is a little baffling. And I think the conversation that needs to happen is what function has particularly Christianity, the church, played as a social organizing force, and why is it that leaving Christianity or denying Christianity is not just a mere intellectual exercise for many people. In terms of where we're going, I think there's a level of intersection between the conversations that we're having about race and economics, and race and politics, and race and socioeconomic status and power, that these are all things that play directly into each other. We know that some of the poorest and most disempowered countries in the world are the ones that are the most religious. The United States being a baffling sort of standout of a very wealthy but very irreligious country. But if you look at the levels of socioeconomic inequality, it actually makes a lot of sense. And as we start having the conversations about reducing those inequalities, about bringing minority viewpoints to the forefront, about addressing some of these issues, we're going to see a corresponding reduction in the popularity of overt religious sentiment.
I think that, what's really interesting about doing this series is when you talk to people, there are people who are professors on the radio, et cetera, those people are used to talking about what's happening within the Black community and speaking with sort of some kind of authority and thinking about solutions. But if you talk to people who are just kind of living their lives and that isn't necessarily the way they speak about the world, it's really interesting, one, for them to be in a space where they can speak with some authority about the world and their kind of place in it. And, I think that a lot of the people I was talking to, they were trying to find solutions, but I think the conversations really went to this idea of stigma, this idea of, with a lot of these topics, especially this season, people feel less comfortable talking about a lot of these topics. Like, I think atheism the week before was eating disorders. These are subjects that are very, very taboo in the community. And I think the more people that we get to speak about these topics and speak about sort of their experience with these topics, the less taboo that they're going to feel.
So what's coming up for you next, Angela?
We're going to do a third season, and I have to sort of wrap my brain around what the third season will be because I just found out that they want to do one, which is great.
Yay!
Yay. So feel free to put some ideas on the Facebook page around the third season, because I think we're definitely going to reach out to the viewers to say, to think about what we want the topics to be. I'm just, I'm working on a fiction script too, so that's kind of all of that's keeping me busy.
Keeping quite busy. Ian, what's up next with you?
Today I posted a 1,000-word discussion on racial privilege and using the analogy of a one-way mirror, talking about how minorities often have some insight into the majority perspective, but that the shoe doesn't necessarily go on the other foot quite as easily. Y'all also had a recent very tragic and very public shooting. And while your country discusses and wrestles with the ramifications of that, we also recently have had a slate of public shootings, which is much, much, much more rare here. And when it does happen, it usually invokes a lot of racial discussion.
I want to thank both of my guests, Angela Tucker and Ian Cromwell. Thank you for being with me. Before I let you go, make sure that my listeners know how to find you. Angela, what's your website?
blackfolkdon't.com to watch the series, and I have a Tumblr, so you just go tuckergirl.tumblr.com, and they can reach me directly.
Lovely. Ian, remind us how we can find you.
I'm on the Free Thought Blogs network. That's www.freethoughtblogs.com/communist.
Thank you so much, folks, for being with me. And let's keep doing stuff that Black folks don't do, shall we?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Sex, Politics, and Religion Hour, Spar with Jamila.